The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Michael Thompson adjusted his red tunic for what he thought would be another ordinary day. He had been standing guard at the palace gates for over 8 years, trained to remain completely still and silent, regardless of what happened around him. The tourists would come and go, cameras flashing, children waving, but Michael and his fellow guards were like living statues. On this particular Tuesday in September, Michael noticed something different in the crowd gathering outside the palace: gates. Among the usual mix of tourists and locals, there was a small girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting alone on the curb. She wore a faded pink dress and clutched a worn teddy bear tightly against her chest. While everyone else was busy taking photos and chatting excitedly, this little girl sat quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks. Michael tried to focus straight ahead, as his training demanded. Royal guards were not supposed to acknowledge individual people in the crowd. They were meant to be symbols of British tradition and discipline, not human beings who could be moved by emotion. But something about this child pulled at his heart in a way he had never experienced during his years of service. The girl had been sitting there for nearly an hour, and Michael noticed that no adult seemed to be with her. Other tourists walked past, some glancing at her briefly, but most were too caught up in their own excitement to notice a crying child. The September air was getting cooler, and the little girl was shivering slightly. Michael could see goosebumps forming on her small arms. As the minutes passed, Michael found himself stealing glances at the child whenever he could do so, without obviously breaking his stance. He noticed that she would occasionally look up at him and the other guards with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. It was as if she was hoping one of them might help her, but she was too young to understand why these men in red uniforms couldn't move or speak. The training that had been drilled into Michael's mind for years began to war with his basic human instincts. Every fiber of his being wanted to step down from his post and ask the child if she was okay, if she was lost, if she needed help. But he knew that breaking character could result in serious disciplinary action. Royal guards who abandoned their posts or interacted inappropriately with the public faced potential dismissal from their prestigious positions. Other guards nearby were also beginning to notice the situation. Michael could see the slight tension in their faces, the almost imperceptible shifts in their posture that indicated they too were struggling with the same internal conflict. Guard duty had taught them to ignore distractions, to remain focused on their ceremonial role. But this was different. This was a child who appeared to be in genuine distress. The crowd around the palace gates continued to grow as the morning progressed, but still no one approached the little girl. Tourists snapped photos of the guards, trying to get them to smile or react, completely unaware of the real drama unfolding just feet away. Some visitors even walked directly past the crying child while positioning themselves for the perfect selfie with the palace in the background. Michael's mind raced with questions. Where were this child's parents? How long had she been sitting? Alone? Was she hurt, lost, or simply overwhelmed by the crowds and unfamiliar surroundings? The longer he stood there, maintaining his rigid posture while watching this small person suffer in silence, the more difficult it became to justify his inaction. The palace protocol was clear about situations like this. If guards observed something, that might require intervention. They were supposed to signal discreetly to their superiors or to palace security. But making such signals required subtle movements that might be noticed by the watching crowds, potentially compromising their ceremonial appearance. The guards were caught between their duty to maintain tradition and their responsibility as human beings to help someone in need. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the palace courtyard, Michael realized that this moment was going to test everything he believed about duty, compassion, and what it truly meant to serve. The little girl continued to sit alone, her quiet sobs barely audible above the chatter of the crowd, but loud enough to echo in the hearts of the men who stood frozen in their ceremonial roles, watching and waiting for someone else to act. The palace clock chimed 11 times, its deep bells resonating across the courtyard, when everything changed in an instant. A security guard in civilian clothes had finally noticed the little girl and was walking toward her with purpose. Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him, thinking the situation would finally be resolved. But as he watched the scene unfold, his relief quickly turned to alarm. The security guard approached the child with the brisk, no-nonsense manner typical of his profession. He spoke to her sharply, asking where her parents were and why she was, sitting alone at the palace gates. The little girl, already frightened and confused, began crying even harder. She tried to explain in broken English, mixed with what sounded like another language, that she couldn't find her mommy, but the security guard's impatience was evident. Michael watched in growing distress as the situation escalated. The security guard, clearly frustrated by the language barrier and the girl's emotional state, began to raise his voice. He gestured for her to stand up, apparently intending to move her away from the palace gates. The child, terrified by this stern stranger, clutched her teddy bear tighter and shook her head frantically, pressing herself against the stone wall. Behind her, other tourists in the area began to notice the commotion. Some pulled out their phones to record what was happening, while others whispered among themselves about the situation. A few people looked toward the royal guards, as if expecting them to intervene, but Michael and his colleagues remained frozen in their positions, bound by protocols that seemed increasingly meaningless in the face of a child's distress. The security guard reached down to take the girl's arm, intending to escort her to a different area where she could be processed according to standard procedures for unaccompanied minors. But the moment his hand touched her, the child let out a scream that cut through the morning air like a knife. It was a sound of pure terror that made everyone in the vicinity stop what they were doing and turn to look. Michael felt something snap inside his chest. All his years of training, all the discipline and tradition that had been ingrained in him, suddenly seemed less important than the frightened cry of a lost child. His hands, which had been perfectly still for hours, began to tremble slightly. His breathing became irregular. The other guards nearby could sense his internal struggle, and their own composure began to waver. The little girl's scream seemed to go on forever, echoing off the palace walls and piercing the hearts of everyone who heard it. She was calling out what sounded like, "Mama, Mama," in a voice filled with desperation. The security guard, now clearly uncomfortable with the attention the situation was drawing, tried to quiet her while still attempting to move her away from the public area. That's when Michael saw something that made his decision for him. As the security guard tried to lift the crying child, her worn teddy bear fell from her arms onto the cobblestones. The little girl reached for it desperately, her sobs becoming even more intense as she saw her beloved toy lying just out of reach. The security guard, focused on moving her quickly, didn't notice the fallen bear. In that moment, Michael understood that some things were more important than regulations and traditions. Some situations demanded humanity over protocol. He could see the other guards struggling with the same realization, their faces showing subtle signs of the emotional turmoil they were experiencing. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, many of them looking disturbed by what they were witnessing. The palace gates, which had stood as symbols of tradition and unchanging ceremony for centuries, suddenly felt like barriers preventing basic human compassion. Michael realized that true honor wasn't about standing motionless while a child suffered. Real service meant being willing to act when action was needed, regardless of the consequences. As the security guard continued to try to remove the screaming child from the area, Michael made a choice that would change not only his own life, but also challenge the very foundations of royal protocol. He could feel the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on him, but the sound of a frightened child's cries weighed even more heavily on his conscience. The moment stretched out like an eternity. Every instinct told him to maintain his position, to trust that others would handle the situation appropriately. But looking at that small, terrified figure and her fallen teddy bear, Michael knew that sometimes the most important duty a person could perform was simply to be human. Without thinking about the consequences, Michael stepped down from his ceremonial position. The movement was subtle at first, just a slight shift in his stance, but it was enough to break the rigid formation that he had maintained for countless hours over 8 years of service. The tourists nearby gasped audibly as they realized what they were witnessing. Never in the memory of most observers had a royal guard abandoned his post while on duty. Michael walked the few steps to where the teddy bear lay on the cobblestones. His red uniform, pristine and perfectly pressed just moments before, seemed to rustle with each step in the suddenly quiet courtyard. He bent down slowly and picked up the small, worn toy. It was softer than he had expected, clearly loved and held countless times by small hands. The bear's fur was faded from years of hugs and adventures, and one of its button eyes was slightly loose. The security guard stopped mid-action, staring in disbelief at the royal guard who had just broken centuries of protocol. The little girl, still crying but no longer screaming, looked up through her tears at the tall man in the red coat who was holding her precious teddy bear. For a moment, everyone in the courtyard seemed frozen in time, as if the world itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Michael knelt down to the child's eye level, his movements careful and gentle. He held out the teddy bear to her, and for the first time since taking his post that morning, he spoke. His voice was soft and warm, completely different from the stern authority one might expect from a royal guard. He said simply, "I think this belongs to you, little one." The girl's eyes widened with surprise and relief. She reached out tentatively and took the bear from his hands, hugging it tightly against her chest. Through her tears, she managed a small smile and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was tiny, but filled with genuine gratitude that seemed to echo across the courtyard louder than any trumpet fanfare. What happened next was something that would be talked about for years to come. Guard James Wilson, who had been standing at the adjacent post, also stepped down from his position. Then Guard Robert Chen followed suit. One by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, every guard within sight of the little girl abandoned their ceremonial posts and gathered around the child and Michael. The crowd of tourists was completely silent now, many of them openly weeping as they watched this unprecedented display of humanity. Cameras continued to record, but the clicking and flashing seemed muted, almost respectful of the moment unfolding. Even the security guard who had been trying to remove the child stepped back, clearly moved by what he was witnessing. Guard Wilson, a man who had served for over a decade and had never so much as blinked while on duty, knelt down beside Michael. He pulled out a clean handkerchief from his uniform pocket and gently wiped the tears from the little girl's cheeks. Guard Chen, who spoke several languages due to his background, began asking the child gentle questions in different languages, trying to determine her nationality and locate her family. The girl responded to Chen in what turned out to be Portuguese. Through halting conversation, they learned that her name was Sophia, and she had become separated from her mother while touring the city. She had been sitting at the palace gates because her mother had told her that if she ever got lost, she should stay in one place and wait for help to come. The child had been there for nearly 3 hours, too frightened to ask anyone for assistance. Other guards began searching the immediate area and coordinating with palace security to locate Sophia's.
Mother!
Guard Thompson, a father himself, sat on the cobblestones beside the child and began telling her gentle stories about the palace and the royal family, helping to distract her from her fear. His normally stern military bearing had completely melted away, replaced by the warm demeanor of a caring adult trying to comfort a scared child. The transformation was remarkable to witness. These men, who had been trained to be living statues, representatives of unwavering British tradition, had become fully human in the span of just a few minutes. Their uniforms remained the same, their ceremonial weapons still at their sides, but everything else about them had changed. They were no longer symbols of rigid protocol, but rather examples of compassion and basic human decency. Palace supervisors and senior officers began arriving on the scene, clearly alerted by the unprecedented breach of protocol. But as they approached and saw the situation unfolding, even these seasoned military officials found themselves moved by what they witnessed. The sight of their disciplined guards surrounding a frightened child with such genuine care and concern was something none of them had ever seen before, and it challenged every assumption they had about the balance between duty and humanity. 20 minutes after the guards had broken formation, a woman's voice could be heard calling desperately from across the courtyard. "Sophia! Sophia!" The voice was filled with panic and relief mixed together. Everyone turned to see a woman in her 30s running toward them, her face streaked with tears, and her hair disheveled from what had clearly been hours of frantic searching. Sophia's head snapped up at the sound of her mother's voice. The little girl scrambled to her feet, still clutching her teddy bear, and ran toward the approaching woman. The reunion was heart-wrenching to witness. Mother and daughter collided in an embrace so fierce and desperate that several of the guards had to wipe tears from their own eyes. The woman, Maria Santos, held her daughter as if she might disappear again, speaking rapidly in Portuguese between sobs of relief. Michael stood slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling on the cobblestones. As he watched the reunion, he felt a profound sense of peace despite knowing that serious consequences likely awaited him. Maria looked up from her daughter and saw the circle of red-uniformed guards surrounding them. Through her tears, she began to understand what had happened. Chen stepped forward and explained the situation to Maria in Portuguese. As she listened, her expression changed from confusion to overwhelming gratitude. She learned that these men, who were famous worldwide for their inability to move or speak while on duty, had abandoned their posts to comfort and care for her lost daughter. The realization that strangers had shown such kindness to Sophia while she had been alone and frightened moved Maria to fresh tears. Maria approached Michael first, since the other guards indicated he had been the one to first break protocol. She took his hands in hers and spoke in halting English. Thank you so much. You saved my baby." Her voice broke as she spoke, and Michael found himself struggling to maintain his composure. He had never imagined that a simple act of human kindness could mean so much to another person. The crowd of tourists, which had grown significantly during the incident, began to applaud spontaneously. The sound started slowly with just a few people clapping, but it quickly grew into thunderous applause that echoed off the palace walls. Many visitors were openly weeping as they witnessed this display of compassion. Videos and photos of the guards comforting Sophia had already begun circulating on social media, with people around the world sharing the story of the royal guards who chose humanity over protocol. Palace officials were now gathered in a huddle nearby, clearly trying to determine how to handle this unprecedented situation. These guards had technically abandoned their posts and broken fundamental rules of conduct that had been in place for centuries. But they had also prevented what could have been a traumatic experience for a lost child and had demonstrated values that most people would consider more important than ceremonial traditions. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer responsible for the guard unit, approached the group. He was a stern man in his 50s who had served in the military for over 30 years. Everyone expected him to immediately order the guards back to their positions and begin disciplinary proceedings. But as he looked at Sophia, now smiling and chattering happily to her mother while still holding her rescued teddy bear, his expression softened. The colonel had children and grandchildren of his own. He understood what Maria must have experienced during those terrifying hours when Sophia was missing. He also recognized the courage it had taken for Michael to make the first move, knowing full well the potential consequences of breaking protocol. Sometimes, the colonel realized, real leadership meant knowing when rules should be bent in service of something greater. Instead of reprimanding the guards, Colonel Harrison did something that surprised everyone present. He stepped forward and saluted Michael and the other guards who had broken formation. It was a gesture of respect and recognition that acknowledged their choice to prioritize compassion over conformity. The salute was crisp and formal, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. Sophia, now calm and secure in her mother's arms, walked over to each of the guards and gave them small hugs around their knees. She had no understanding of the significance of what they had done or the rules they had broken for her sake. To her, they were simply kind men who had helped her when she was scared and alone. Her innocent gratitude was perhaps the most powerful validation of their actions that any of them could have received. The palace gates had witnessed many historic moments over the centuries, but this simple act of human kindness would be remembered as one of the most meaningful. The guards slowly began to return to their positions, but something fundamental had changed. They were no longer just ceremonial figures representing tradition and protocol. They had become symbols of the idea that true honor sometimes requires the courage to act according to one's conscience, even when it means breaking the rules. The story of the royal guards who broke character to help little Sophia spread across the internet faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within hours, the videos and photographs taken by tourists had been viewed millions of times on social media platforms around the world. News outlets from every continent picked up the story, with headlines praising the guards' compassion and questioning whether centuries-old protocols needed to be reevaluated in light of basic human decency. Maria, Santos, and Sophia had returned to their hotel, but not before exchanging contact information with several of the guards. Sophia, still carrying her teddy bear, had insisted on drawing pictures for the nice soldiers who had helped her. Her childish artwork, featuring stick figures in red uniforms standing next to a small girl with a teddy bear, would later be framed and displayed in the guards' quarters as a reminder of why they had chosen their profession in the first place. The palace administration faced an unprecedented situation. Never before had royal guards broken protocol in such a public and dramatic fashion. The incident had been witnessed by hundreds of people and recorded by dozens of cameras. Traditional military discipline would normally require immediate punishment for such a breach of conduct, but the overwhelming public support for the guards' actions made any punitive measures extremely difficult to justify. Phone calls and emails poured into Buckingham Palace from around the world. Parents shared stories of their own children getting lost and expressed gratitude that people like Michael and his colleagues existed. Military veterans wrote to say that the guards had upheld the true meaning of service, which was to protect and help others, regardless of the specific rules they were supposed to follow. Even other royal families from different countries sent messages of support, acknowledging that sometimes humanity must take precedence over protocol. The guards themselves were struggling with the aftermath of their decision. Michael, who had initiated the break in protocol, found himself at the center of intense media attention. Reporters wanted to interview him, photographers followed him when he left the palace, and his personal social media accounts were flooded with messages from strangers around the world. Some praised him as a hero, while others criticized him for abandoning his duty and disrespecting centuries of tradition. During their off-duty hours, the guards who had participated in helping Sophia gathered to discuss what had happened and what it might mean for their careers. Wilson admitted that he had never felt more proud of his service than when he saw the relief and gratitude in Maria's eyes. Chen spoke about how the incident had reminded him why he had wanted to become a guard in the first place, to serve and protect people, not just to stand motionless as a tourist attraction. The emotional weight of their decision was significant. These men had built their careers around discipline, following orders, and maintaining traditions that stretched back generations. Breaking those traditions had not been easy, even for such a worthy cause. They worried about how their actions would be perceived by their fellow servicemen, their families, and their superiors. The uncertainty about their professional futures created stress and anxiety that affected their sleep and their ability to focus on their regular duties. Colonel Harrison called a meeting with all the guards involved in the incident. As they assembled, in his office, the atmosphere was tense. The men stood at attention, expecting formal disciplinary action. They had prepared themselves for the possibility of reprimands, demotions, or even dismissal from their positions. Each guard had spent hours reflecting on whether they would make the same choice again. And despite their concerns about the consequences, every one of them had concluded that they would act exactly the same way if faced with similar circumstances. Colonel looked at each man individually before speaking. His expression was serious, but there was something else in his eyes that the guards couldn't quite identify. When he finally broke the silence, his words were not what any of them had expected. He told them that, in his 3 decades of military service, he had rarely witnessed such clear examples of moral courage and true leadership under pressure. Rather than facing punishment, the guards learned that their actions had prompted a comprehensive review of royal protocol procedures. Palace administrators were working with child welfare experts and security professionals to develop new guidelines for situations involving lost or distressed children on palace grounds. The guards' decision to prioritize human welfare over rigid protocol had initiated conversations about how traditional institutions could adapt to better serve the needs of a modern, compassionate society. The incident had also led to changes in training procedures for royal guards. New recruits would now receive instruction not only in ceremonial duties and security protocols, but also in basic first aid, crisis intervention, and child psychology. The goal was to prepare guards to handle situations like Sophia's more effectively, while still maintaining the dignity and tradition associated with their roles. 6 months after the incident, Michael received an unexpected invitation that would complete the remarkable journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness. Maria Santos had written to him, inviting him and his fellow guards to visit her and Sophia in Portugal during their vacation time. The little girl, now speaking much better English thanks to lessons inspired by her experience in London, had never forgotten the kind soldiers who had helped her when she was scared and alone. The reunion took place in a small coastal town outside Lisbon, where Maria worked as a teacher, and Sophia attended the local primary school. When the guards arrived at the Santos family home, they were greeted by a very different Sophia than the frightened child they had met at the palace gates. She was confident, smiling, and excited to show them around her hometown. She still carried the same worn teddy bear, but now it was joined by a small toy soldier that she said reminded her of her friends in London. Over dinner with Maria's extended family, the guards learned more about the day Sophia had gotten lost. Maria explained that they had been visiting London as part of a difficult period in their lives. Sophia's father had passed away the year before, and the trip to London was meant to be a healing experience for both of them. When Sophia disappeared in the crowded tourist areas near the palace, Maria had experienced every parent's worst nightmare, made even more terrifying by being in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language fluently. The guards were moved to learn that their simple act of compassion had meant so much more than they had realized. It wasn't just about comforting a lost child, it was about showing kindness to a family dealing with grief and loss during one of the most frightening experiences of their lives. Maria told them that Sophia still talked about the guardian soldiers who had protected her, and that the experience had helped restore the little girl's faith in the goodness of strangers. During their visit, the guards also discovered that their story had inspired changes far beyond the palace gates. Schools across Europe had begun using their example to teach children about moral courage and the importance of doing the right thing, even when it might get you in trouble. Military academies were discussing their actions as a case study in leadership and ethical decision-making under pressure. Sophia had prepared a special surprise for her visitors. With her mother's help, she had learned to sing God Save the Queen in English, and she performed it for them in the family's small garden. Her pronunciation wasn't perfect, but her enthusiasm and genuine affection for the men who had helped her made it one of the most moving renditions any of them had ever heard. There wasn't a dry eye among the guards as this brave little girl honored them with her song. The visit to Portugal also gave the guards time to reflect on how their lives had changed since that September morning. Michael had been promoted to a training position where he worked with new recruits, helping to instill in them both the importance of tradition and the courage to act with compassion when circumstances demanded it. Wilson had started volunteering with local children's charities during his off-duty time. Chen had become an advocate for better protocols for handling international visitors who might face language barriers during emergencies. On their final evening in Portugal, Sophia presented each guard with a hand-drawn certificate declaring them honorary knights of Sophia's kingdom. The certificates were decorated with crayon drawings of castles, teddy bears, and smiling soldiers. These simple pieces of paper, created by a child's loving hands, had become more meaningful to the men than any official military commendation they had ever received. As their visit came to an end, Maria took Michael aside for a private conversation. She told him that his decision to step down from his post and pick up Sophia's teddy bear had changed both their lives in ways he couldn't imagine. Sophia had learned that there were good people in the world who would help her when she needed it most. Maria herself had discovered that even in a foreign place surrounded by strangers, human kindness could bridge any gap of language or culture. The guards returned to London with a deeper understanding of the impact their actions had created. They resumed their ceremonial duties at the palace gates, standing straight and proud in their red uniforms. But now they carried with them the knowledge that true honor came not from rigid adherence to rules, but from the courage to act with compassion when it mattered most. They had learned that sometimes the most important duty a person could perform was simply to be human, to recognize when someone needed help, and to provide that help regardless of the consequences. The story of the royal guards who broke character to comfort a lost child had become more than just a viral internet sensation. It had become a reminder that in a world often divided by differences in culture, language, and tradition, the simple act of showing kindness to a frightened child could unite people across continents and inspire positive changes that would last for generations. Sophia's teddy bear, once fallen on cold cobblestones, had become a symbol of the power of human compassion to transcend even the most rigid boundaries of protocol and tradition.